The streets of Queens buzzed under a gray New York sky, horns blaring as Zachary navigated his way home, a grocery bag swinging in his hand. At 52, his face carried lines of a life poured out, every wrinkle a story of love and loss. Zach lived in a one-bedroom apartment, its walls papered with faded stripes, a space just big enough for him and Ethan, the son he'd raised alone since the boy was 3. Ethan's mother had left one spring, her suitcase packed for a man who promised more, leaving Zach with a toddler and a promise to keep. A gay man in a city that could be as cold as its winters, Zach had no roadmap, only a heart that refused to let Ethan go. He became father, mother, everything, trading dreams for duty in a world that didn't always see him. By day, Zach filed papers in a Manhattan office, his desk buried under memos, his tie loosened by noon. At night, he mixed drinks at a bar in Astoria, smiling through tired eyes as patrons tipped in crumpled bills. Once he'd sketch canvases, dreaming of galleries, his pencils catching light and shadow. But when Ethan came, art supplies gathered dust, sold to buy diapers, then sneakers, then textbooks. Ethan was his masterpiece now, a boy with bright eyes who loved robots and stars. Zach sat through every school play, every parent-teacher night, clapping loudest when Ethan won a science fair with a model rocket that soared. He helped with homework at midnight, math problems blurring through yawns, and saved every spare dollar for a college fund, whispering to himself that Ethan would have what he never did. Being gay wasn't something Zach hid, but it wasn't something he shouted either. In the 90s, when Ethan was small, neighbors whispered, their glances sharp when Zach held his son's hand too long. He feared Ethan would pay for it, kids taunting him for a dad who didn't fit their mold. So Zach kept his truth quiet, not out of shame, but for love. He dated once or twice, quick coffees that went nowhere, his heart too full of Ethan to make room. Every night he read to his son's space adventures, pirate tales, his voice soft as he tucked Ethan in. I love you, he'd say, no matter what. Ethan would nod, sleepy, and Zach would linger, praying the world wouldn't judge his boy for who his father was. As Ethan grew, the distance did too. High school brought new friends, late nights out, and silences at dinner Zach didn't know how to fill. Ethan asked less about Zach's day, shared less about his own. Zach saw it, the way Ethan's eyes darted away when classmates asked about his parents, the way he'd mumble, just my dad, and change the subject. It stung, quiet and deep, but Zach pushed it down. He worked harder, took extra shifts, got Ethan into a top university with a scholarship he'd fought for. Standing in their small kitchen, Zach looked at Ethan's acceptance letter, framed on the fridge, and smiled through the ache. He'd given everything, believing love would be enough. He didn't know that one day in a crowded hall, that love would be reduced to a footnote, his name unspoken by the son he'd carried through life. Will Zach and Ethan's bond survive the tests ahead? Subscribe to our channel for stories that hold tight to love and truth. Don't miss what's next. Zachary boarded a Greyhound bus in Queens, the engines rumble a steady hum as he clutched a bouquet of sunflowers, their petals bright against his old Navy vest. At 52, he'd spent 2 decades raising Ethan alone, every choice shaped by love for the boy who'd become his world. Today was Ethan's graduation from a top Boston university, a milestone Zach had worked double shifts to make possible, from bartending nights to endless office memos. He'd mended this vest himself, it seems tight, the only suit he owned, wanting to look proud for his son. The bus rolled north, New York's skyline fading, and Zach smiled, picturing Ethan in a cap and gown, the little boy who'd built rocket models, now a man with a degree. He didn't know that in a few hours his heart would break under the weight of words he'd never imagined. Boston greeted him with spring air, the campus alive with families in sundresses and ties, balloons bobbing above green lawns. Zach arrived early, his shoes polished, the sunflowers wrapped in paper he'd saved from Ethan's last birthday. He found a seat in the auditorium's back row, a sea of faces between him and the stage, but close enough to see Ethan's name in the program, printed bold. His chest swelled, memories flooding. Ethan's first day of school, his science fair wins, the night Zach read him stories of stars. He'd skipped meals to pay for Ethan's textbooks, sold his old art supplies for dorm fees, always whispering, you'll make it. Today, watching Ethan step into his future, Zach felt it was worth every sacrifice, every sleepless shift. The ceremony began, music swelling as graduates filed in, black gowns swaying. Zach leaned forward, spotting Ethan's familiar mop of hair, his grin wide as he waved to someone in the crowd. Zach's eyes stung, pride mixing with relief. He'd done it, raised a son alone, a gay man in a world that hadn't always been kind, keeping Ethan safe from whispers about his dad. Ethan had grown distant in college, calls shorter, visits rare, but Zach chalked it up to youth, to new worlds pulling him away. He adjusted the sunflowers, ready to hand them over, to hug his boy and say he'd always be there. Then Ethan took the stage, selected to speak as an honor student. Zach sat taller, hands clasped, every word a victory. Ethan's voice was clear, thanking professors, friends, and then, my mother and her husband, Amber, who gave me emotional strength and helped me become who I am today. Zach froze, breath caught, the auditorium's cheers a distant roar. His mother? The woman who'd left at 3, never calling, never writing, or frying? Amber, a name Zach didn't know. He waited, heart pounding, for his name, for Dad, the word he'd earned through years of love. Instead, Ethan paused, smiled, and added, and a family friend who helped along the way. The words landed like stones, sharp and heavy, splitting Zach's world in two. He sank into his chair, sunflowers wilting in his grip, faces around him blurring. A family friend? He'd bandaged Ethan's knees, paid for his braces, sat through every fevered night. He'd hidden his own truth, fearing Ethan would face taunts for a gay father, and still stood by him, unwavering. The crowd clapped, oblivious, as Ethan stepped down, diploma shining. Zach stared at the stage, replaying every moment he'd given, every "I love you" whispered in the dark. Had Ethan been ashamed, afraid to claim him? The vest felt tight, the flowers too bright, a reminder of a bond he thought unbreakable. He wanted to stand, to find Ethan, to ask why, but his legs wouldn't move, anchored by a pain he couldn't name. As families spilled onto the lawn, Zach stayed seated, the auditorium emptying, laughter echoing outside. He saw Ethan through a window, surrounded by friends, his gown off, smiling like the world was his. Zach's fingers traced the bouquet's ribbon, tied with care, now a weight he couldn't carry. He stood, slow and heavy, and walked to the exit, leaving the flowers on his chair, their yellow petals stark against the wood. The bus back to Queens waited, its doors open, and Zach boarded, Boston shrinking behind him. He'd given Ethan everything, but today he'd been reduced to a stranger, a footnote in the story of the son he loved more than life. He didn't know if he'd ever find the words to ask why, or if Ethan would ever see the father he'd pushed away. Zachary stood in the emptying auditorium, the echo of applause fading as families streamed toward the lawn, their laughter sharp against his silence. Boston's spring light spilled through tall windows, but Zach felt cold, his hands empty without the sunflowers he'd left on a chair. At 52, he'd come to Ethan's graduation expecting pride, a moment to hold his son close after years of raising him alone. Instead, Ethan's speech had cut deeper than any wound, naming a mother who'd vanished and a stranger called Amber, while Zach, the father who'd given everything, was reduced to a family friend. The words looped in his mind, each one a pinprick, unraveling the love he'd built through sleepless nights and double shifts. He needed to see Ethan, to understand why, even if the answer broke him more. He took a breath, squared his shoulders, and stepped into the crowd, his old vest a quiet armor against the pain. Outside, the campus buzzed, graduates in black gowns posing for photos, balloons drifting above picnic tables. Zach scanned the sea of faces, his heart lurching when he spotted Ethan near a fountain, his diploma clutched tight, surrounded by friends in bright shirts. Ethan laughed, head thrown back. The boy Zach had read to, now a man of 22, his future wide open. Zach moved closer, weaving through hugs and cheers, his throat tight with a question he'd never thought to ask. He'd bandaged Ethan's scrapes, paid for his science camps, sat through every milestone, all while guarding his own truth as a gay man, fearing Ethan would suffer for it. Had that fear come true, or was it something else, something Zach couldn't see? He reached out, fingers brushing Ethan's shoulder, voice soft. "Ethan," he said, and the group turned, their smiles faltering, eyes curious but blank. Ethan spun around, his grin fading to something stiff, like he'd been caught off guard. "Hey," he said, stepping back, his friends exchanging glances, one whispering to another. Zach felt their stares, a weight he'd known in Queens when neighbors judged him for raising a boy alone. "Can we talk?" he asked, voice steady despite the tremor inside. Ethan nodded, leading him a few steps away, the fountains splash a thin shield from the crowd. Zach looked at his son, at the eyes he'd watched grow from toddler to scholar, and forced the words out. "Why did you call me a family friend?" he said, his voice breaking, tears welling despite his fight to hold them back. "I'm your dad, Ethan. I raised you. Every day, every choice. It was for you." Ethan's gaze dropped to the grass, his diploma a barrier between them. He shifted, hands in his pockets, the confident speaker gone, replaced by a boy who couldn't meet his father's eyes. "I didn't mean it like that," he mumbled, voice barely above the fountain's hum. "It's just, I didn't want to get into your sexuality. People might not get it, they'd ask questions, make it weird." The answer landed like a slap, raw and honest, slicing through Zach's hope. He'd hidden his truth to protect Ethan, skipped dates, buried his heart, thinking it kept his son safe. But Ethan had hidden him too, not from cruelty, but from a fear Zach had spent years trying to shield him from. The irony burned, a knot of love and loss tightening in his chest. He stood still, searching Ethan's face for the boy who'd clung to him during storms, who'd promised to call him dad forever. "I gave you everything," Zach said, quieter now, tears spilling. "I didn't need a stage. I just needed you to say it." Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it, his friend's laughter drifting closer, pulling him back. Zach nodded, a small gesture, all he could manage. He turned, legs heavy, and walked away, the crowd parting around him, oblivious to the man whose world had shifted. He passed the chair where he'd left the sunflowers, their petals scattered now, trampled by careless feet. The auditorium loomed behind, its doors wide, but Zach didn't look back. He found the bus station, Boston streets a blur of brick and bloom. Climbing aboard, he took a seat by the window, the engine's drone a faint comfort. He thought of Ethan's speech, the pride he'd felt, now ashes in his mouth. He'd raised a son who shone, but at what cost? The fields outside rolled past, green and endless, and Zach wondered if Ethan knew the weight of his words, or if he'd ever feel their echo. He'd poured his life into love, but today that love had been set aside, a truth too heavy for a stage. He didn't know a notebook left unwritten would one day bring them face to face again. Ethan sat in his Boston apartment, the city's autumn rain tapping against the window, a cardboard box open on his coffee table. At 23, he was a graduate student, his life a whirl of lab reports and late-night study groups. But the package in front of him stopped time. It had arrived without a sender's name, no address, just his name scrawled in black ink. Inside was a worn notebook, its leather cover cracked, pages yellowed at the edges. Ethan recognized it instantly, the journal his father Zachary used to scribble in when he thought no one saw, back in their Queens apartment when Ethan was small. A year had passed since graduation, since Ethan's speech had named Zach a family friend, a choice that haunted him in quiet moments. He hadn't called, hadn't written, letting distance grow. Now, holding the notebook, his fingers trembled, sensing it carried a weight he wasn't ready for. He opened it. The first page dated when he was 4, Zach's handwriting neat but hurried. "Ethan fell off his bike today," it read. "Cried for an hour, but I got him back on. Sold a painting to buy him a helmet." Ethan's throat tightened, picturing Zach's hands, rough from bartending, guiding a wobbly bike in a Queens park. He turned the pages, each one a snapshot of his childhood through Zach's eyes. "Ethan's fever hit 102 last night," one entry said. "Sat up holding him, missed work. He said, 'Dad,' when he woke." Another, from middle school. "Ethan wants to join robotics club. Took extra shifts to cover the fee. He smiled all day." Ethan's chest ached, memories flooding Zach at his science fairs, clapping despite ink-stained fingers, Zach sewing his Halloween costume, a rocket ship with cardboard fins. Every line was love, etched in sacrifices Ethan had been too young to see. The entries grew sparser as Ethan hit high school, but the care didn't fade. Ethan got into that Boston school, Zach wrote at 17. Sold my easel for his deposit. He's going to be a scientist. Ethan paused, recalling the scholarship, thinking it was luck, not knowing Zach had traded his last piece of art. The final page was different, undated, a single line in shaking script. I chose to be your father when no one else would. I only ever wanted to be called Dad. Ethan's vision blurred, tears falling onto the paper, smudging the ink. He saw Zach at graduation, eyes wet, asking why, and his own answer, people might not get it, rang hollow now. He'd meant to protect himself, to avoid questions about a gay dad, but he'd erased the man who'd built his world. He grabbed his phone, dialing Zach's number, hands shaking as it rang. A woman answered, her voice kind but clipped. This is the hospital, she said. Zachary had a mild heart attack last week. He's stable but resting. Ethan's stomach dropped, the notebook heavy in his lap. He drove to New York, Boston's skyline fading, his mind racing with images of Zach alone, the man who'd carried him through fevers now in a sterile bed. At the hospital, a brick building in Queens, Ethan found Zach's room, curtains drawn, machines beeping soft. He stepped inside, ready to kneel, to beg forgiveness, but Zach turned his head, eyes dull, face older than 53. A nurse stood nearby, her clipboard still, watching the reunion that wasn't. I sent it by mistake, Zach said, voice low, barely looking at Ethan. Didn't mean for you to read it. Ethan clutched the notebook, words spilling. Dad, I'm sorry. I didn't know. I didn't see. Zach's gaze stayed on the window, rain streaking the glass. I raised a man who's ashamed of me, he said, each syllable a wound. I have nothing more to give. The nurse touched Ethan's arm, guiding him out, her whisper gentle. Give him time. Ethan stood in the hall, notebook pressed to his chest, Zach's words echoing louder than the hospital's hum. He'd grown up loved, held by a father who'd asked for so little, and he'd given him silence instead. The drive back to Boston was long, the notebook beside him, its pages a map of a love he'd failed to honor. He didn't know what to do next, how to bridge a gap he'd widen. Zach's refusal stung, a mirror to the pain Ethan had caused. But the journal burned in his mind, a truth he couldn't unsee. He thought of Zach's hands, folding laundry, tying shoelaces, writing those lines in the dark. Ethan had built a life on that love, but standing in its shadow he felt small, unsure if words could mend what he'd broken. He didn't know a stage, far from Queens, would one day give him a chance to speak the name he'd buried, to call Zach what he'd always been. Ethan stood at a podium in a Boston conference center, the hum of fluorescent lights mixing with the rustle of a packed room. At 24, he was a research fellow, his days filled with lab work and data. But today was different. The symposium on LGBTQ plus elder healthcare had drawn doctors, activists, and families, their faces expectant as Ethan adjusted his notes. A year had passed since he'd held his father's journal, its pages heavy with Zach's sacrifices, nights without sleep, dreams traded for Ethan's future. That day in the hospital when Zach turned him away had left a scar, a vow to make things right. Now, standing before strangers, Ethan felt his father's absence like a weight, unsure if Zach, now 54, would ever hear the words he'd failed to say. He touched a photo in his pocket, a faded snapshot of them at 5, and began to speak, his voice steady but raw. The crowd leaned in as Ethan shared his work, studies on aging queer communities, their struggles often unseen. Then the moderator asked, "What inspired you to choose this path?" The question hung, simple but piercing. Ethan paused, fingers brushing the photo, his mind flashing to Queens, to Zach's hands tying his shoes, reading him stories, giving everything while hiding his truth to keep Ethan safe. He'd called him a family friend once, a mistake born of fear, and lost him to silence. The journal had shown him what he'd ignored, and now he couldn't hide anymore. He looked out, heart racing, and pulled the photo from his pocket, holding it up, a small square of memory. "This is my father," he said, voice breaking. "His name is Zachary. He raised me alone, gave me everything, and I once denied him." The room stilled, every eye on Ethan as he continued. He's gay, and I was afraid people wouldn't understand. I hurt him, called him less than he was. But his love, his strength, it's the only foundation I ever needed. I'm here because of him, to make sure no one like him is forgotten." His words trembled, tears falling, but he stood tall, the photo a beacon. The crowd was silent, then applause rose, soft at first, then loud, a wave of warmth Ethan hadn't expected. He stepped back, wiping his eyes, scanning the room for a face he'd know anywhere. In the last row, half hidden by shadows, sat Zach, his hair grayer, his face lined, tears glistening on his cheeks. Ethan froze, pulse loud, unsure when Zach had slipped in, if he'd heard it all. The session ended, attendees mingling, but Ethan moved through them, drawn to the back, his steps quick. Zach stood, hands in his coat, eyes wary but soft. The man who'd carried him through life, now looking small, fragile. Ethan stopped, breath catching, and spoke, voice low, but clear. "Dad," he said, the word of promise. "Thank you." Zach's lips quivered, a sob breaking free, and Ethan stepped forward, wrapping his arms around him, their first hug since childhood, tight and unbroken. The room faded, the noise gone, just a father and son holding what they'd nearly lost. Zach whispered, "I never stopped." And Ethan nodded, tears mixing, knowing he meant love, always love. They left together, Boston streets cool under a setting sun, talking of small things. Ethan's research, Zach's new sketches, a canvas he'd started again. The journal rested in Ethan's bag, no longer a wound but a bridge, its pages proof of a bond stronger than shame. Zach walked slower, his heart still healing, but his smile was real. The father who'd given all now seen, named, loved. Ethan knew he'd spend years making it right, but today he'd given Zach the stage he deserved, a truth spoken loud enough to heal them both. In a city that held their past, they found a future, not perfect, but whole, built on a love that had never let go. Who's the person you'd thank for everything? Share below and subscribe to join stories of love and redemption.